Welcome back, everyone, to Progressively Incorrect. My name is Zach Groshell, and I'm your host. I am so excited today to be talking to Doug Gray, who I met at the Alaska MTSS Conference just this year, who has some fascinating stories to tell us about what it means to be a teacher in Alaska, and in particular in rural Alaska, serving bush communities that are often very isolated from the larger cities in that state. I'm extremely excited about like all the things we get to chat about. I think Doug is doing amazing work with with Alaska MTSS. But before then, I just wanted to plug the Explicit Teaching Institute. I run a week-long training program every summer, including this summer of 2026. July 2026, check out the show notes for the Explicit Teaching Institute, and you can see what's going to happen this year, what are the different topics, and how you can get signed up. I feel like it's the cheapest ticket in town. It's in New York City, and the greatest city in the world, in my opinion. I think you'll have a great time if you sign yourself and other teachers up for this opportunity. Doug, thank you so much for coming on the podcast. I'm excited to chat with you about this interesting topic.
Thanks, Zach. Thanks for having me. I appreciate it.
Doug, how about you go ahead and introduce yourself to our audience? What do you do, and what have you been working on lately?
Sure. So I am the professional development director for Alaska Staff Development Network, which is under the Alaska Council for School Administrators. And really my role is to help plan professional development for educators across the state of Alaska. So we have 53 school districts, and I work a lot with those school districts to help align statewide professional development to support the work that they're doing.
And I met you at Alaska MTSS, and an amazing conference, by the way. I had never really got to enjoy what there is to do in Anchorage, and it was magical in January to come out there in such a beautiful time of the year. And Anita Archer was there, and a lot of really great speakers. We'll talk about that at the end. I wanted to start by talking about like your time in Alaska. Like, what first drew you to this context and like the unique challenges and opportunities that are in Alaskan schools and communities?
Well, yeah, it is interesting. Alaska is not where I thought I would be when I started out my career 30 years ago. I grew up outside of Boston, Massachusetts, and Alaska was really never on my radar. And it really wasn't until I always think Brad Pitt in the movie A River Runs Through It, because I had seen that, and I was like, gosh, I really would be interested in, going someplace remote and interesting and fascinating. And so that kind of stuck with me. And then one day I was leaving class, and there was at the bulletin board there was a job fair in Missoula, Montana, and I was like, "That's a sign." And I remember going home and calling a travel agent, getting a ticket so that I could go out to Missoula, Montana to interview, because had convinced myself that that's where I wanted to be after I had graduated from college. And so I flew out to Missoula, Montana, and as I remember landing and being like, "Oh my gosh, there's no way I can live in Missoula, Montana. It is way too remote." And I got off the plane and I went to the job fair, and I had no intent of doing anything remote. I was interviewing with like Arizona, Phoenix, Flagstaff, and I actually had an interview with Flagstaff, Arizona. But I happened the last day of the conference, I walked by the Alaska table, Southwest Region School District to be exact, and ended up talking to Dick Montgomery, who started chatting with me, and explained that I was a special ed teacher and that I was looking for a position. And he's like, "Well, that sounds really fascinating. These are all the things that we do." And I had no idea really what was going on, other than he's like, "Would you like to interview?" And I was like, "Sure, I'd love to interview." And so I interviewed with him. And I remember at the end of the interview, he's like, "Well, would you like to come and work in Alaska?" And I just remember thinking like, "Oh my gosh, this guy is offering me a job on the spot. I must have really nailed it." And I was so excited. I said yes. And I remember going back to the hotel room and calling my folks and telling them that I had taken a job in rural Alaska, and they were just like, "Alaska, what?" And that's kind of where the journey started. And it just kind of we spent the summer planning for it, but back then there was no internet or anything. It was 1995, and I remember going to the library, or the public library, and trying to find information about this village called Togiak, Alaska, where I was going to go. And obviously there was nothing really there. And so I had no real schema to figure out what I was doing or where I was going or how I was even going to get there. My ticket when I went to get to the travel agent, it flew me from Boston to Cincinnati, Cincinnati to Dallas, Dallas to Seattle, and then Seattle to Anchorage. And I started out, that was like I realized I was going far, but I didn't realize how far I was actually going.
And so, my experience with this whole with what you just explained was you go to the big teaching job fair, and in the dusty corner at the very far end is like the sort of international tables, right, or something, and then you see like this three sort of like smiling folks at the Alaska tables who are all like there, and then the word on the street is that you of course you can have this amazing experience, but also that like there's some incentives built in that might actually bring you over there, and also that life can be pretty hard and it's not for everyone. So for people who've never experienced it, like what is daily life like teaching in like the Alaskan bush? And how did that environment sort of shape your approach as an educator?
In some ways it's, you have the curriculum, so you focus in on that and you use that, but it's more about yeah, like I was in a community of 900 people, which was a larger village, but the only way in and out was by plane. There were no roads. I was located in Bristol Bay. There was no other really communities around us that were close, that were, driving distance. Everything, you really had to fly someplace or to, in the wintertime, you could snow machine or if you had a big enough boat, you could get in a boat and maybe go to a couple of the communities that might be a little bit closer that were on the coast. But really, you're pretty isolated in the sense of like you're in the village and that's where you're going to be, and you're really pretty much immersed in the community, the school. That is your life, and so it really does kind of, you put a lot of time, energy, and effort into the work that you're doing because um, that's really it is. There isn't really, you don't go to the mall, you don't go to the movies, you don't go to the store. You find the community that's there and you figure out what you need to do to make it enjoyable. And it was the best experience. I mean, I had only planned on being in Alaska for a year, and this is now I'm year 30, so it sort of stuck.
And when I was at the conference, there were all these folks coming from these remote areas of Alaska who this was their like first time in 3 to 6 months maybe of being in a place with stuff, it was so
Right.
I could see that like wide-eyed look of there. It's like there's things to buy, right? And even just the fact that we were walking, kind of pub crawling, they were like, oh, to be able to walk on a sidewalk that has salt on it, that like
Yep,
like
yep.
I mean, is that something you experienced as well?
Yeah, when I remember, so my first year when I was in Togiak, my brother was getting married and I had to fly back to Massachusetts for the wedding. And I remember, like the weather was going down and I was just like, gosh, I'm going to get weathered out here. So I need to figure out a plan. And the plane, and these are all small planes, six-seaters that are flying around. And that you have like regular flights and stuff, but not all the time. And I remember the flight that I was supposed to be on had canceled, and I remember getting on the radio and radioing over planes that were flying overhead, asking people to land so that I could jump on a flight so that I could get to Dillingham, where our hub was, which is a community of about 2,500 people, so that I could then get to Anchorage so that I could fly back to my for my brother's wedding. So yeah, I mean, I took, when I moved out there, I took for granted the idea of just being able to get to places so quickly, and then realizing pretty soon that, you have to do a lot of planning and that sometimes things may not go the way that you want them to just because of the circumstances of weather having to be a factor. Because small planes, your little six-seaters, do not fly in low visibility fog or, wind or high winds or stuff like that. So you do have to plan.
I kind of wanted to talk a little bit about the communities themselves because folks of this podcast know, like, I talk a lot about explicit instruction. And so, what that often involves is needing to collect responses from all students. It means attendance is sort of important because, like, we're building step by step on skills and a load of other factors. And so often when we talk about rural areas, even in the lower 48, we're talking about, and especially with really tight knit communities, there's this wonder, this question that comes up like, how do I teach kids for which I don't really understand their context very well? I'm sort of an outsider and I might not understand like their culture or anything like that. And so maybe talk to us a little bit about that, like maybe the identities and the close-knit relationships and how you might have leveraged those to teach.
Yeah, it really is. I mean, community is huge. And, for a lot of our rural communities out here in Alaska, high teacher turnover is a problem. And so there's always a little bit of a resistance to when you first go out to community to kind of make connections with community members, just because there is a little apprehension of like, how long are you going to be here? And I think the other part too is you also have to really take the lead from, the community itself. Like, what are the components that are important to them? And, in school is important. And so, but a lot of the subsistence lifestyle is important. And so how do you blend that? And as a guy coming out of Massachusetts that never understood what subsistence meant, I mean, I took a lot of cueing from my parents and my students about what that meant and how do you bring that into the classroom and how do you make sure that you're making connections with them? And because the connections that I thought I had were not going to make a lot of sense to a community that, is on the ocean, no roads, subsistence is huge. There's the Alaska Native component of it. It's a Yupik community, so all of their cultural components that are involved in their life are really integral to the success of, teaching kids. And so it can't be just me going in there and using the curriculum and saying, this is how we need to do it. It really is learning from families. And I did a lot, like I was lucky, I was able to do a lot of home visits. I was able to get into homes and listen to what people were telling me. And that was always key, I felt too, is like I am not the lead on any of this. I'm not the expert in terms of, what I need to do to help support a student. I really have to learn and understand what the families are talking to about and what's important to them, and then bring that into the classroom.
It's sort of like I remember I left one of the schools I was working at after only a year. I had another opportunity, and it just high turnover of staff, and 28 new teachers every year, kind of thing. And it was sort of like when I told the class at the end of the year, kind of left it to the very end so it didn't become this thing. Hey guys, I've got another job somewhere else, but it's not because of you. It's just because life, goes in waves like this. And just that one really high power voice in my class, the boy going, yeah, they all leave, everyone leaves here, your time has come too. How do you think at a system wide level we sort of overcome this? Because I certainly worry that and would want to advocate for the kids that are in these remote areas that they get just as good of an education as if you lived anywhere else in this country.
Yeah, for sure. And that was a big piece, I feel like, for what I was trying to do. I was, like I said, I was lucky. I had some really good, strong mentors, and that was really important. I was able to be in a community where there had been teachers that had been in that community for years. And I also was fortunate that that Togiak had there were several teachers from Togiak that were there, Alaska Native teachers that were part of that community. So they really were helpful and instrumental in building the bridge between home life, cultural life, and school life, and what does that mean, and how do you blend them? So, in that sense, I was lucky, and I think about now as now I'm supporting educators, across Alaska, like. how do we support them so that they are successful in our rural communities? Because that what you talked about, yeah, is still an issue. We have people that fly in and then fly out. They realize that this isn't for us, and we try really hard at trying to make sure that people have all the information that they need before they step foot into Alaska or onto a plane, that they understand that there is some components that, when we say you're going to a rural community or a remote community in Bush, Alaska, there is not roads. What does that actually mean? And I know that I didn't know what that meant. I had no schema on any of those things. I remember my first time landing into Togiak and having a panic attack in the plane because all I saw was a dirt road that began and ended, and I had no concept that that was actually the runway. And it wasn't until we landed that I realized that, oh my gosh, runways can be dirt. And I never thought about that before. And so, we try to make sure that we give people information so that they have a good understanding of where they're going. Because once you get there, it's great. I mean, like I said, I can't say enough positive things about my time. I was out in rural Alaska for 9 years, and I loved it all. And it was a great experience to be able to be there. And I really appreciate the community itself that I was able to be parts of, because I was able to be in three different villages over those 9 years, and it really helped mold me to be who I am now.
That's awesome. You're talking about the runway and you're talking about the no roads and stuff. I think people often, when they think about the rural sort of remote Alaskan education context, they think of like the prices of things being really expensive, and even in Anchorage, right? It's just so funny.
Yep.
I didn't realize there was such a connection to Seattle because everybody I met has been to Seattle and to some extent has gone shopping there. So like this is several layers past in terms of probably the cost, the affordability. How true is that? Like what is that experience like when you go to the store? Like, how are you getting your stuff, you know?
Well, yeah, no, that's so funny. Yeah, I mean, the cost is huge because you're not just getting things to Anchorage, you now have to get things to these rural places. And, I was lucky enough, Togiak was large enough that it had actually larger than a convenience store, but smaller than like a grocery store. But it also sold, on top of it selling food and produce and all of those other things, it also sold four-wheelers and guns and clothes, and it was really a bit of everything. But I remember my first year being there, and you would go shopping and you would spend the money. And I don't remember the cost of all things, but I remember seeing a small watermelon, which was a very rare thing to get in Togiak or in our communities. Um, and I was so excited about it, I didn't even think about the cost of it. And I remember paying for it, and it was $25. And this was back in 1990, like 95, 96, and spending $25 for a watermelon that probably weighed maybe a pound and a half or 2 pounds. But like, I was so excited about it that it didn't even really think about it. But yeah, like costs, like it would, I think now I see people that post things online, and for a half a gallon of orange juice, they're spending $15. For a dozen of eggs, people are spending $12 to $15. That is something that people do have to think about. And so, when you were reflecting on meeting the people that were flying in from villages to Anchorage, yeah, they're gonna go to Costco, they're gonna go to Walmart, and they're gonna load up on everything and either mail it back with them or like take it back to them as luggage, or they're gonna ship it. Because yeah, when you get out to the villages, you're still going to spend a lot more money just because you do have to pay for all that freight costs that get there. So yeah, getting to Anchorage was always a big treat when I lived out in rural Alaska, because it wasn't just the idea of getting out of the community. It was like I was going to get to go shopping. I was going to be able to go out to dinner. I was going to go see a movie. I could go to the mall, like those types of things that you just didn't have when you were out there in the day-to-day life.
And there's something about like everyone coming together at the conference that I was really surprised about, right? It tends to be your typical even if there's just one big dyslexia conference or one big MTSS conference in a state, everybody seems to like take turns going to it and may not return in sort of like to maintain their tradition of going every year. And there's other conferences. There's just a lot of competition, right? And you go to the Alaska MTSS conference and you're like, everybody has been here before, or if it's their first time, everybody's connected by one person or another. Like in this, it's very community feeling for a state that geographically is so vast, and large. I mean, has that been your sense as well as you sort of put this together?
Oh yeah, 100%. I mean, so this is where we just finished our 15th year of this conference, and when we started it, I was here in Anchorage, and it really came from this idea of, it costs so much money to send people to the lower 48 to go to a conference, to hear national presenters, to hear the current research that's being done out there, and it's like, we're not getting a lot of bang for our buck when we send one person down to Seattle or Denver or Chicago or Boston. And so it really was like, hey, I wonder if these people, these presenters would want to come to Alaska. And it really was that simple idea of just like, well, let's ask them. Let's get together and see what this would look like. And let's see if we can get some speakers to come up. And, we all we did was start asking people, and next thing we knew, we had um, a core of groups, and Anita Archer being one of them, who has been, she just comes. Like, we don't even invite her anymore. She just lets us know if she's going to be able to make it there or not. And just the idea of that we get to have Anita Archer, who is so well respected, and her research and her practicality in terms of how she approaches explicit instruction, and how that really blends with what we, as Alaska education system, what we're trying to do, was just awesome. And we've really been able to grow, from that to be like, hey, we have these presenters, and that, we're really trying to move the needle. And, MTSS is one way that we really, well, back then it was RTI, and, we've kind of morphed it now. And now we're wrestling with IMTSS, because we're trying to realize that you need all the components for it to work. But really, it came out of just this idea of being a cost-effective way to say, like, hey, can we get people to come to Alaska? And rural Alaska, it is so much, it's expensive to fly to Anchorage, but it is so much cheaper to get people to Anchorage, than it is to get down to the lower 48, that it was a no-brainer. And we now have school districts that really build this conference into their budget, so that because they value, that ability to get their educators, and not just teachers, but principals and superintendents and paraprofessionals, are all part of the conference. I mean, yeah, we're a large state, but we're a small state in population. But I mean, our conferences, I mean, they're about, usually it's about 1,000 people that show up just from Alaska. Although we had some people last year that came from New Mexico and Washington State even. So word is slowly growing.
It's awesome, and there's such a unique opportunity, I think, to curate like the message, I suppose, like to make sure that the information is up to date, is relevant, is about what people are talking about. Education is just so splintered. Like we don't have a real education system, I would say, in the United States. There's just a gajillion systems, and like it's kind of cool that there's this uniting factor that you are able to build up and curate the offerings. I find it awesome. I'm sure that you have some juicy stories that we've now buried it towards the end. But do you have anything for us in terms of like maybe what would really illustrate what it's like to join and choose this particular experience for yourself as an educator out in the Alaskan bush?
Well, I mean, it was the best thing that I ever did. I mean, and I didn't know that, as a 25-year-old coming up to Alaska, it was, the level of ignorance is bliss in some senses, just because I didn't know what I was going to get myself into, and I had no schema of understanding. Like I remember flying into Dillingham before I got to Togiak, and looking off in the distance and being like, oh, well, Dillingham must be a big town. I see a skyscraper. And I remember getting to Togiak and talking to someone, a teacher, about that. And they're like, Doug, there's no skyscrapers in Dillingham. And I'm like, yeah, I saw it. It was like there, Doug, that was the water tower. And I just, I really, like you just didn't know what it really meant. But the opportunity to be in a community that is really focused in on education, really focused in on community, you have a lot of flexibility to really dig deep and really make some strong connections with your students was fantastic. When I was out in Clark's Point, this other village, which was much smaller, we were a school of 18. So I went from Togiak, a school of 250 people, and then I moved to a smaller community of where we just had 18 students in the district in our school, and that was a whole other nuances of learning things of what that meant because there were no stores there or anything like that. But I was teaching fifth through eighth grade. There was a other teaching partner, and she taught the younger grades, and I taught the older grades. So I had fifth grade through eighth grade, and I was like, "Gosh, what do I do?" And we actually did a project where we did a whole ethnographic study on the community of Clark's Point, and we worked with an instructor or professor from Breadloaf out of Middlebury, and we did a year-long project with these students, and they developed a whole book on the community of Clark's Point that now sits in the archives at the Smithsonian. And just to be able to spend in a school like if I was here in Anchorage, I probably wouldn't have had that opportunity as readily available to me to be able to do that because we would have been influenced by a lot of other scheduling things. And when you're a teacher out in rural Alaska, you get to decide the schedule. We decide if like, we're going to do PE a little bit later because I was also the PE teacher, I was the art teacher, I was the music teacher. I covered lunch break. I did everything. When I walked into that building and students showed up, I was with them until it was time for them to go home. And then I was there even after all of that. But I had the flexibility and the ability to be like to spend the time with the students to do the things that I thought was important, but also what they were telling me was important to them. And yeah, it was fantastic. I consider myself a very fortunate individual to have been able to end up in Alaska and to be surrounded by the people that really were very patient with me because as a kid coming out of Boston, never mind the accent, never mind the fast talking, never mind just the ignorance of understanding of what rural Alaska was and subsistence. I learned so much and really just appreciate the time that I had with all of them.
It's really cool. It's making me want to like revise my life plan right now a little bit. But Doug, so happy to have you on the podcast. I think people are going to get a kick out of this. Listeners, thank you so much for tuning in to Progressively Incorrect every week. Trying to mix it up and give you new topics. You might have noticed that, right? Going down some different rabbit holes as I've been doing these side quests in education consulting. I'm meeting really cool people like Doug, and it's inspiring me to think about, I guess, all forms that education comes in this country and internationally. Doug, thank you so much for coming on. Take care.
Great. Thanks a lot, Zach. I really appreciate it. We'll see you in January.
Yeah, nice. See you then.